Okay, so imagine waking up to the news that a world power has just gone into another country and captured its leader. Well, on January 3rd, 2026, that's not a movie plot. That's exactly what happened in Venezuela. It was a lightning-fast military strike that basically turned the global order on its head. So, right now we're going to break down how this unbelievable event unfolded, what led up to it, and what it all means for the rest of us. Our story kicks off in the middle of the night in Caracas. It's 2 in the morning, and suddenly that silence is just shattered by the roar of jets and the boom of explosions. If you are a resident there, all you'd know is chaos and confusion. For the rest of the world, well, this was the start of something huge.
And then, just as the sun was coming up, the White House drops a bombshell that confirms the unthinkable. The president of Venezuela, Nicolás Maduro, and his wife, they weren't just overthrown, they were in U.S. custody. The immediate question on absolutely everyone's mind was, wait, how is that even possible?
Well, this was Operation Absolute Resolve. And let's be clear, this wasn't a full-scale invasion. This was a lightning-fast surgical strike. So let's get into the play-by-play of how it all went down.
It played out like something straight out of a movie. First, airstrikes essentially blinded the Venezuelan military. Then you had the best of the best, Delta Force, the FBI, moving in on the ground. And get this, in just over 3 hours, from the first explosion to wheels up, it was all over. Maduro was on a plane heading straight to New York. But you know, an operation this crazy doesn't just happen overnight. This thing was years in the making.
To really get why this happened, you gotta look at the backstory. I mean, the relationship between the US and Venezuela had been terrible for years. But in those final months, things went from bad to worse, and they got there really, really fast. It really started to heat up after a 2024 election that pretty much everyone outside Venezuela called a sham. After that, the US just kept turning up the heat. First, a military buildup in the Caribbean, then they jacked up the reward for Maduro's arrest, and the final step, a naval blockade, basically seizing Venezuelan oil tankers. Every single move was just another turn of the screw.
And this really gets to the heart of the whole mess. You literally had 2 different guys claiming to be the president. You had Maduro, who held the palace because the military had his back, and then you had Edmundo Gonzalez, the guy most people believe actually won the election by a landslide, who was forced to flee the country. That's what we call a legitimacy crisis, and it gave the U.S. all the political cover it felt it needed to make a move.
So with Maduro suddenly gone, the aftermath immediately raised 2 gigantic questions. Okay, who's in charge now? And what was the real reason the U.S. did this?
So what was the official story? What reason did the United States give for launching such a dramatic military operation against another country?
Officially, this wasn't an act of war. It was framed as law enforcement. The U.S. pointed to a years-old indictment against Maduro, accusing him of running something called the Cartel of the Suns, basically saying he was leading a massive drug trafficking network. But a lot of people suspected the real reason had nothing to do with drugs.
And then there's this. This is a quote from Donald Trump himself from a few years before the raid, where he flat out talks about taking Venezuela's oil. You can imagine this quote, more than anything else, is what made people think the whole operation was less about justice and way more about resources.
Back in Caracas, though, the American plan hit a bit of a wall. The government didn't just collapse like a house of cards. Instead, Maduro's vice president, Delcy Rodriguez, simply stepped up and took over. And here's the kicker. The military backed her. So Madurismo, the political system Maduro built, was still in power. It just had a new face at the top.
Now, the new government did try to make a sort of goodwill gesture. They released some political prisoners, but just look at that number, 139. When there's an estimated 800 or more people in jail, releasing 139, well, it was seen as more of a symbolic move than any kind of real change.
An event like this, of course, sends shockwaves everywhere. The second the news broke, the world started choosing sides, and it created this deep, deep geopolitical divide.
The dividing lines were drawn almost instantly. You had the usual U.S. rivals like Russia and China who were furious. But what's really interesting is that key allies like France and Spain were also condemning it. On the other side, you had countries like Argentina and Israel cheering it on. And then stuck right in the middle were Venezuela's neighbors who were just really worried about what this meant for the stability of their own backyards.
And you know, that division wasn't just international. Back here in the United States, public opinion was just fractured. Look at this, it's split into 3 almost perfectly equal pieces. A third of Americans were for it, a third were against it, and a third were just completely unsure what to think. No consensus at all. And you could literally see this division out on the streets.
In cities all over the world, Venezuelan exiles were celebrating what they saw as freedom. But in Caracas, Maduro supporters were protesting what they called a kidnapping. And right in Times Square, protesters were chanting, "No blood for oil," which pretty much summed up the whole conflict in 4 words.
So after all the initial reactions, the operation left behind these massive legal questions and just a ton of uncertainty about what in the world happens next for Venezuela.
Beyond all the politics, there was this fundamental legal question that even the UN started asking. Did the United States just commit an international crime?
And for most experts in international law, the answer was a pretty clear yes. They argued it broke the most basic rule in the UN Charter. You know, the one that says you can't just use force against another country. It didn't have the UN Security Council's okay, and it definitely wasn't self-defense. In fact, some experts started calling it exactly what it looked like, a potential crime of aggression.
And no matter what happens, no matter what anyone says, it all comes back to this one staggering number, 300 billion. That's how many barrels of oil Venezuela is sitting on, the largest proven reserves on planet Earth. And that immense wealth is both its greatest blessing and its deepest curse, and it's going to shape every single thing that happens from here on out.
So here's where we're left, an unstable Venezuela, a government that's still run by the very same party, and the world's biggest powers circling all that oil. The US might have gotten their man, but they definitely didn't solve the country's problems. The huge question now is, did this operation put Venezuela on a new path to democracy, or did it just light the fuse on a much, much bigger conflict?